All right, in this file, we're going to be looking at the issue of infant daycare. And in particular, we'll talk about the potential effect of daycare on attachment, but we'll cast our net wider because there's a lot of data out there on daycare's possible effects on many areas of child development. I do want to emphasize that we're talking about infant daycare, so putting a child into daycare when that child is, say, less than 2 years of age. To me, and I think to many, that's a very different issue than putting a child who is maybe 4 into like a part-time preschool. So we're going to be focusing on putting the youngest of the young into a daycare experience. And it's a really important question in our culture because in our country, parental leave is pretty miserly, right? Pretty almost non-existent. According to law, which actually wasn't a law until the 1990s, companies have to provide 12 weeks of parental leave, and that is unpaid. All right, so a couple of important points here in that those 12 weeks that is required by US law is much shorter than most modern countries. In Europe, many countries provide, half a year, sometimes a year. I have friends in Russia who get a whole year and a half off their job when they have children. Secondly, we'll note that it's unpaid. So although in our country a parent's position at work will be held for them, they don't receive a paycheck from the company for being at home with very young children. All right, and that is also different in many other countries around the world. My friends in Russia, although they don't receive their full pay, do receive a stipend. So this, of course, creates for American parents quite a dilemma. If I return to work, how is daycare going to affect my baby? And another part of this is that parents in our country usually foot most of the bill for their daycare. In many other countries, daycare is very heavily subsidized by the government, but not so in the United States. And so for parents, it rarely pays to return to work part-time because usually daycare is going to take up, a very large chunk of one person's salary. And so usually parents will return to work full-time so that they actually can have some disposable income, right? Money to spend on other things from their job. In addition, this dilemma sometimes raises its head before 12 weeks because, parental leave is unpaid in our country. Sometimes parents are, needing to get back to work before those 12 weeks are up. So sometimes children as young as, 3 or 4 weeks of age are put into daycare. And so over the next few slides, we're going to take a look at the different contexts for daycare, and then we'll take a look at some of the research on the impact of infant daycare, especially from some important long-term studies that have been done over the last couple of decades. Let's move on. All right, if we were meeting in class together, I would actually pop these two questions up on the screen and we would discuss them. But that's going to be kind of hard to do, given that I'm here at home and you're listening to this who knows where, right? So I'm just going to take a stab at offering some answers myself. First of all, what are the possible forms of daycare? Of course, there are a variety of places that babies end up being cared for. All the way from something as intimate and familiar as grandma coming to stay with them at their own home, all the way to a major daycare center where they're taken to a large facility. There's probably a special room there for babies, several trained caregivers, other kids, etc. And there's a lot in between too. The child might be delivered to a neighbor who does daycare. Maybe that neighbor is just caring for the one baby. Maybe that neighbor takes in, several different kids from the area as, kind of their work, their job. So, there's lots of different ways that a child can be cared for, even in our setting. In our setting, some kind of home daycare is the most prevalent option. In other words, whether it's at home with grandma or with the neighbor lady down the street who takes in a couple of kids, most children are cared for in a private home. All right, the second question, what are the possible pluses and minuses for an infant in daycare? And I'm sure probably You could come up with a couple of pluses and minuses right off the top of your head. In terms of what people are concerned about, or what people on the street might offer as a possible outcome. In terms of pluses, we might talk about a child having a chance for socializing, especially if you've got a daycare situation where you've got educated caregivers. Quite possibly the context will be even more stimulating than it would be at home. The right kind of developmentally appropriate toys given where the children are at, and so forth. In terms of minuses, kids who go to daycare are typically more sick more often than those who don't go to daycare. And in the short term, that's a drawback, but actually in the long term, that tends to be more of a plus in that they seem to build up immunity. And ultimately, kids who are in daycare as infants, once they get into elementary school, are not as sick as those who stay home. So the illness being a drawback is only for the short term. Some people are concerned in terms of minuses that even at a young age, the child will pick up habits and values that are different than the family's. And there's also been a perennial concern for the quality of the attachment between child and parent if the child is being cared for by somebody else. And so as we move on to the next couple of slides, we will take a look at the best answer we have, still not the perfect answer, but the best answer we have about the effect of infant daycare on attachment, as well as its effect on other outcomes as well. Let's take a look together at some of the data from research on infant daycare and its outcomes. We're going to be relying here over the next couple of slides on data from some important long-term studies conducted over the last couple of decades, where they followed kids both who were in daycare as infants and those who weren't, and really compared the development of the children in those groups over the course of time, well into elementary school and beyond. Even though these studies are about as high quality as you can get in the field, which doesn't mean perfect, but at least they're fairly high quality, we need to acknowledge that research on infant daycare and daycare in general is a very political topic. This has implications for how we spend our tax money. It has implications for, women's rights. Should women be at home with the children? Should they have the right to work, etc. In addition, as you'll see, the research is pretty muddy, as I call it. In other words, there's not a whole lot of clear answers. So that's the case in most areas of psychology, though. All right, so let's take a look first at two general categories of outcomes, cognitive outcomes and social outcomes. And then on the next slide, we'll take a look at some of the factors which seem to predict for a given child whether or not daycare will be a decent experience for them. All right, so as you see there, in terms of cognitive effects, so rate of language acquisition, academic achievement, it seems that kids who have had infant daycare experience are a bit ahead on average than those who haven't, if they have gone to daycare that is of high quality. And by high quality daycare, we mean things like having a nice, clean, healthy facility, having caregivers at the daycare who are trained, they've had a class like this, maybe they've had some courses in early childhood ed. They have a consistent schedule at the daycare, so it's very predictable there, who's going to be there in the morning in terms of the adults, who's going to be there in the afternoon. And also they have kind of appropriate and stimulating materials for the kids to play with. Okay, in that case, it seems that daycare is associated with a bit of a cognitive boost. Now, I don't want us to misinterpret that. This doesn't mean that kids who go to infant daycare are geniuses and those who don't, are going to be behind intellectually forever. It means that there's a boost for many of the kids in daycare. It's a little boost, nothing huge, but often kids kind of even out and catch up as they go through elementary school and beyond. Okay, so in terms of social effects, we can first look at the issue of attachment, which is one of the main things we're concerned about here. The research suggests that there are slight increases in the chance of an insecure attachment. especially among those who already come from not the greatest parenting situation. So if mothering in a family is not as sensitive perhaps as it should be, then it seems that daycare kind of exacerbates or makes worse that situation. Okay. I want to note that the word slight is italicized though, because I don't want you to think, okay, you go to infant daycare, and especially maybe if there's kind of family issues, that definitely means the kid's coming out with a insecure attachment. That is not the case. We mentioned in our previous set of lectures that in our culture, the chance or the probability of being diagnosed, if you will, or labeled with insecure attachment is about 30%, about 3 out of 10 kids. You know, in kids who go to infant daycare, that number is going to be a bigger, 33, 35%. You know, I'm kind of picking that out of thin air, but that's about the magnitude of difference that we're talking about. So please note that that means that the probability of a child going to daycare being insecurely attached is still less than 50-50. Okay, I mean, most kids who go to infant daycare still end up to be securely attached. It's just that the probability of an insecure attachment is raised just a bit. Okay. Similarly, we also see slight increases in acting out, problem behavior, you know, fights on the playground and things like that. Again, not a big difference, but those who go to infant daycare, the probability that they will have issues with aggressive acting out is a little bit higher. Okay, so really, I mean, there's, in some ways, there's not a lot going on here because the differences between kids in infant daycare and those who are not or were not in infant daycare in these areas, although identifiable, are still not huge. Okay, it's, I think, much more helpful to identify which factors, which variables increase the risk that daycare is going to be hurtful, and apply those to situations, you know, of individual children, concrete children. So that's what we're going to do on the next page. So let's move on. So here we're going to take a look at some of the factors that for any given child increase the probability that being in infant daycare would lead to problems later on. And I've phrased these factors as questions, and it is my secret hope that each of you will print out this slide and file it away in your important papers file, and, you know, down the line when you have a baby, we'll pull it out to think about whether or not a particular daycare setting is appropriate for your child. Right? That's my dream, at least. So I phrase these as questions so that it will be, I think, more accessible to us, you know, as parents and concerned adults in the life of a child. Okay, so these questions are based on the factors identified by the studies that we appealed to in the previous slide, these long-term studies that have traced kids' paths, whether they went to daycare or not, and compared them if they're in daycare versus not daycare. All right, so is the daycare of high quality? We've already talked about what high quality daycare is. If the answer is no, if it's missing any of the characteristics that I mentioned earlier, that does increase the risk for a child of going to that daycare. In other words, it increases the likelihood that the daycare will affect them negatively. So if the answer to this question is no, it's a risk factor. Okay, that's probably fairly straightforward. We've already mentioned the idea of daycare quality. Secondly, is the child placed in care very early in life? We've already talked about how in our culture, you know, a lot of kids are in daycare as of 3 months. Some are in daycare even earlier because the parents can't live without, you know, one paycheck coming in, even for a few months. And so sometimes it's 3 or 4 weeks and the little one's, you know, already in daycare. If the child is placed in daycare super early, that does increase the risk that there will be some kind of negative outcome. You know, so to place a child in daycare at 2 months is different on average than placing a child in daycare as of 18 months or something like that. Is a child placed in daycare more than 10 to 20 hours a week? Okay, if yes, then that's a risk factor. In other words, if a child is in daycare more than time, that increases the risk of problems in the long run. And of course, that's a double bind for parents because, as we've already said, it's often not worth it, in the United States at least, for parents to return to work part-time, right? And this would imply, if a child is only in daycare for 10 to 20 hours a week, that somebody is home with a child, usually a parent, right, for the other 20 work hours a week. So the fewer hours a child spends in daycare, the better. Now again, it doesn't necessarily blow the percentage of risk through the roof, but it does increase the risk a little bit that there will be some kind of negative impact. Okay, realizing, of course, that at the other extreme, I mean, sometimes you've got kids in daycare for like 60 hours a week. I mean, the parents have to commute and maybe work on Saturday, and wow, that's pretty tough for a kid. All right, number 4, is a child going to be in care for a long stretch of time? Okay, well, how is this different than the previous one? Well, what we're talking about here is the calendar, right? I mean, month in and month out. So if a child is in daycare, but maybe one parent is an educator, so the child is going to have large chunks of time at home with a parent over the summer, spring break, Christmas break, etc., that's not a bad deal necessarily. If the child is in daycare from January 1st through December 31st, year in and year out, that's when we start to talk about risk factor. In other words, that kind of persistent month in and month out, daycare experience, especially if it's appealing to the former one, right? 40 hours a week or what have you. That kind of experience is going to increase the risk that there will be poor outcomes from infant daycare. The 5th item isn't really so much related to daycare per se. Daycare is simply kind of a correlate, I guess you might say, of this. But a lot depends, of course, on how the parents are dealing with the work situation, right? So do working parents have energy to interact with a child in a positive way? If the parents come home from work exhausted, if they come home cranky because they don't like their work, if they just don't have the time and energy to connect with their child, to spend that quality time, as we might say, then that's a risk factor. Okay, again, increases the risk that the daycare experience will have negative outcomes. And then finally, obviously there's not a whole lot you can do about this, is the child a boy? Boys are a little bit more likely than girls to have to show a negative impact of being in daycare from infancy. And this is the first time we're encountering the idea of boys being more vulnerable. We will encounter this again. It seems that in transitions, perhaps especially transitions that involve some kind of loss, right? And here we have maybe the loss of the full-time attention of a parent. When parents divorce, we see a similar outcome. Boys tend to fare a bit worse than girls, and so we'll return to this a little bit later in the semester. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about with infant daycare. I wish I had a really clear answer for you. Yes, it's great, or no, it's not. But we hardly ever get such simple responses or simple answers in psychology. So welcome to the club.